Isn't spring amazing? I get so excited every year when this time of year rolls around and it's time to get out there and plant a few things and enjoy all those gorgeous blooms. What I'd like to do is talk to you about some of the things that are going on out there in the garden that may help you make a more beautiful and satisfying place for yourself and answer some questions that we're receiving from you. We're always looking for ways to connect with one another. And so today, what I thought I would do is talk a little bit about daffodils and a lot of things that are emerging out there during the springtime period. So if you know me, you know I'm crazy about daffodils. Who isn't crazy about daffodils? What is there not to love about a daffodil? They are disease resistant. They are deer resistant. That's right. We get so many questions from you all about what deer will not eat and how to keep deer out of your garden. It's the number one question, but I'm here to tell you the daffodil is one of the plants that you want to plant that deer will not touch. You see, there are alkaloids in the stems of the daffodils, in the foliage of the daffodils, in the flowers of the daffodils that are actually poisonous to the deer, and they stay away from them. That's why we have planted over 450,000 daffodils at Moss Mountain Farm. And if you hadn't come out to see them, sometime book a tour and come out and see us in March and see these fields of bloom. We've planted over, I don't know, probably 175 different varieties over the past 12 years. And they come in all shapes, colors, and sizes, within that realm of what daffodils bloom. We don't have any blue daffodils, but we certainly have gorgeous white ones in all shades of yellow and some with orange trumpets and ruffled trumpets. As you may know, there are 12 divisions of daffodils, and each one of those have a different flower shape and form, which I think makes them a terribly interesting plant. And they are simple to grow. The other thing is they're perennial. Yeah, they come back year after year. So like I said, what is there not to love about a daffodil? So I've got a few questions here that have come from viewers. So here's one from Michelle, and she's saying, do you have to feed daffodils anything? And what do you do after they flower? That's a very good question. You want to plant daffodils in the fall in reasonably good soil. They'll take poor soil, but if you dig a hole, you want to add a little compost in the bottom where the basal plate will then produce roots early in the fall and begin to establish that bloom. Now, the thing you want to keep in mind, when you plant daffodils, if you can put a little compost in the bottom of the hole, that's great for those roots when they first begin to emerge. A daffodil will root in all winter long, and then in the spring they come up. If you're planting daffodils for the first time, a particular variety in your garden, but you already have pre-existing daffodils, you'll find that the ones that you've planted in the previous fall will be a little late in flowering. And what's really important when you're thinking about daffodils, if you want to continue your bloom, a lot of people go, well, I love daffodils, but they don't really bloom that long. So what? Plant 3 or 4 different varieties, maybe 7 varieties, and choose from the early, mid, and late flowering ones. So over the course of an entire month, you have daffodil flowers. I mean, give them a break. They can't do everything, can they? This is a variety that has been a very good increaser for us, one that reliably comes back. I did say daffodils are perennial, and they are, but we found that some varieties over the past 12 years at Moss Mountain Farm have come back more reliably. Of course, we've gotten 2, 3, 4 years out of almost every variety, but some of them are very, very dependable, like these ice follies. What I love about ice follies is that as they fade, they almost turn white, and they have this really beautiful pale yellow trumpet. And on a daffodil flower, what you have is the collar, which surrounds the trumpet of the daffodil. And this is where they get very interesting, because you can, this trumpet or corona can be split, it can be very flat, it can be double. The range of bloom shapes is really quite astonishing. And we love to collect buckets of these, load them up in the wheelbarrow there in the field, and then bring them in and use them in the house for decor. And the other thing about the narcissus, which is the genus of this plant, is that it is a plant that has a marvelous fragrance, or at least I love the fragrance of them. But getting back to Michelle's question about feeding them, once they flower, what you want to do is sprinkle a little fertilizer around the bulb. We call that side dressing. Just side dress it with a little fertilizer. We love to use an organic fertilizer. As you know, we keep a lot of poultry and sheep and horses at our farm, so we've got some of that good old barnyard organic manure. But just choose an all-purpose organic fertilizer and fertilize those bulbs. What you're wanting to do, Michelle, is you want to preserve that green foliage, not only the leaves, but the stem, for as long as possible. Because what happens after this plant flowers is that the stem and the leaves, through photosynthesis, actually recharge that bulb and provide energy to the bulb in the way of starches. They build it back up so you'll have a bloom again next year. So this idea of giving them a little food once they begin to emerge, or sometime when they're flowering, or just soon after they flower, is not a bad idea. Now, a lot of people wonder if you should take the flower heads off once they fade. That's not really necessary. It's more important, I think, to keep the stem intact, because that stem will actually help engage in photosynthesis and keep that bulb going for you. What do you do after they flower? A lot of people are, I think, a little fussy about that. It's best to leave the daffodil foliage alone for the very reasons I just explained. But if you just have to cut them back, wait at least 6 weeks, better 8 weeks. What I like to do is let them just die back naturally. What they tend to do is the foliage will fall over once the bloom fades. Then the foliage begins to turn yellow. And then over time, that foliage withers and dries and turns brown, and then suddenly they're gone, and you don't know that they're there until the next late winter when they begin to emerge. One of the early daffodils for us that I always love to talk about is a variety called Reinfeld's Early Sensation. It's our first daffodil to flower at the farm. It's followed by February Gold. These are two very early flowering narcissus or daffodils. We've had Reinfeld's Early Sensation bloom the 3rd day of January when we've had milder winters in this part of Zone 8. That's where Moss Mountain Farm is. Okay, so that was Michelle's question. Thank you for that. And then here's one from Dean. Dean is asking, daffodils came up, but no buds or blooms. What's wrong? Well, several things could be going on there. First of all, the daffodils that we have at Moss Mountain Farm that do so well, and if you think about where you see them blooming, it is typically in full sun, right? Or you may find them in a fence row, maybe at an old farm or homestead, but they're still getting at least 6 hours of light. So if you're trying to grow daffodils in the shade, you're going to get a bloom the first year. But after that, Dean, you're not going to get any more flowers likely. They'll sputter a little bit, but they really need that sunshine for them to really come on strongly. Now, the next thing you need to think about is to fertilize. And we answered Michelle's question. Fertilization can also help boost, if they're getting the full sun. Fertilizing them when they emerge is a good time to start. Let them take up as much of that nutrient as possible. All-purpose fertilizer is really all you need to use. And then just let them die back naturally, as I've already described. The other thing that may be keeping them from blooming is the fact that they may need to be divided. A lot of times you'll see a lot of foliage coming up. The thing to do is, if they're not blooming, go ahead and dig them while you have green shoots coming up, and separate them, and then replant them in your garden or in the field or wherever you're having this display of daffodils, and water them in because they're going to have some foliage. Again, you want to hold that foliage in good order for as long as possible for it to rebuild the bulb. But the point is, dividing these heavy clumps can also help incite more bloom, and that's what you want with them, of course. Now let's take another question here. This is from Ellen, and she's asking about what kinds of things are good companion plants for tulips. Well, that's a very good question because one of the things I like to do as a designer is I like to couple my daffodils, we'll get to tulips in a minute, with daylilies. And if you think about it, what happens is you get that daffodil coming up. The daylily foliage is still, it likes it warmer, so it's staying small. That daffodil comes up, it blooms. The daylilies are beginning to grow. The daffodil flower fades. It's getting all the nutrient it needs. It's getting all the sunshine it needs to rebuild that bulb. And what happens is the daffodil dies back as the daylily foliage emerges. And you know what happens in June? We get those gorgeous daylily blooms. So those make two really good companions, the spring flowering bulb and this wonderful old-fashioned perennial, the daylily. And there's so many gorgeous varieties of daylilies to choose from. And of course, they do well in full sun. Now, let's talk about, Ellen, the tulips. Tulips, I tend to, in at least zone 8, like to plant where they get a little bit of shade. Tulips typically don't come back reliably for us in this part of the world because it gets so warm so soon, the foliage dies back. Going back to that whole example that I described earlier in answering Michelle's question, you have a need for that bulb to be recharged. And what happens is the tulip foliage dies back too quickly. And so if I plant 100 tulip bulbs, next year, if I leave them in the ground and I don't touch them, and in this case you do want to break the tulip bloom off. You want to deadhead them because you don't want any energy going into producing seed at the end of the plant where the flower was. So clip those off, leave the stem. If you do that, what I've found in zone 8 is that we'll get about 50% return. Next year I'll get about 25% return, and you can see you just get this diminishing return of blooms with tulips in an area where the spring can be rather warm and the foliage goes away. So I like to plant tulips where they can get some afternoon shade, all right? So a good companion for the tulip is the hosta. Hostas will take filtered light, so will tulips. Hostas will take a few hours of full sunlight a day. Typically that morning light is best. We've had tulips last for a very long time on the north side of the house where it's cooler and shadier. And if you're looking for tulips later in the season, if there's any chance of them blooming, they're going to be on that cool side of the house every time because that's what helps preserve the bloom, just those cooler temperatures. But there are so many varieties of hostas that integrating some of these tulip bulbs in and among your hosta collection can be very beautiful because particularly if you go with early varieties of tulips. Again, just like the daffodils, you can get early, mid, and late flowering tulips. I like to blend them so I've got that full month of bloom. But with my hostas, I like to go with a couple of early varieties that will bloom in among the hosta. The hosta foliage begins to emerge after the tulips are already up. They've already put out their foliage, and in some cases, they've already bloomed. All right, let's see now. We have a question here. Planting under trees with lots of roots. It's kind of a tough one. Some trees are more forgiving than others. Maples, as you may know, the roots come almost to the surface. It's very problematic, I think. We do a lot of bulb planting in containers. I think that that may be the best bet. Norma is asking if there was enough soil there for them to actually grow. We have red maples where it would be almost impossible to penetrate the root system, Norma, to get bulbs in there. Typically what I like to do is do a ground cover under these trees, like a vinca minor, a pachysandra, some of the just classic old ground covers, English ivy, if you'll keep the English ivy off the house or off the trees. A lot of people think that English ivy kills trees. By the way, it does not. English ivy can become very heavy in a tree, and it can break a tree down, particularly if your part of the world is prone to ice storms like it is for us. What happens is you get this immense weight from all that frozen water and on the leaves of the ivy, and it will break a tree down. So we try to keep the ivy off the trees. And the aerial roots on ivy don't really seem to break brick down. A lot of people fuss about that, but I've seen 18th and 19th century houses where the mortar's still very much intact. And I think it's because of the ivy. House is still standing, actually. So good ground cover. One of my favorites is Euonymus coloratus fortunii, long word, also known as winter creeper. We use it a lot at the farm. It's the ground cover I use right at the front of the house. The reason I like it is because it's so maintenance free. You can take a line trimmer and trim it off. You can cut the edges, and so it cuts beautifully. And within this ground cover, you can plant bulbs, and these bulbs will come up and bloom. But trying to get the bulbs to grow under a tree in those roots is very difficult. And the best thing that we've seen, Norma, is to find some very large decorative containers and put your bulbs in those and place those under the trees on the root system and let the ground cover grow and cover the roots. And that can make a beautiful display or focal point in your garden. So give that a thought. We have another question here about some of the smaller bulbs that aren't often used. Teresa is asking, what can I do with grape hyacinths? Wonderful, wonderful plant. And I'm going to get off on a little tirade here about lawns. I am a guy that loves an organic lawn, which means lawns, if you go back in sort of our historic neighborhoods throughout the country, you'll find where they haven't used any pre-emergence, where they haven't used any broadleaf weed killers, you get an amazing array of little wildflowers and interesting things that come up in your lawn. And to me, that is so much more interesting. And among those are some of these little bulbs, like grape hyacinths. There are patches of those in the old cemeteries here in central Arkansas and throughout the South where you'll see these little grape hyacinths flowering, also spring beauties, as well as the little bluets, the little tiny blue flowering wildflowers. And to me, that's an infinitely more interesting and ecologically sustainable lawn than a pristine monoculture of a single monocot or grass, which it can be. Yeah, of course, they're lovely when they're pristine and you see this beautifully mowed lawn. But for me, really, I like to have the mixture of things kind of going on. And you can get that effect once you mow them after they've already finished flowering. But yes, I do think some of the minor bulbs are often overlooked. The little grape hyacinth is one that we found that comes back very dependably, along with the daffodils out in our field of daffodils at Moss Mountain Farm. Some of the other smaller bulbs to keep in mind would include some of the species tulips. There's a wonderful one called Tulipa clusiana, or Lady Jane, is a cultivar that's lovely. And we found that this particular little miniature wild tulip will come back more reliably. I've had it in my garden for 7 years, and Lady Jane has come back. And it's a very small tulip, thin-leafed. There's also a yellow one called Tulipa tarda, which is, as I mentioned, kind of a bright yellow, and they're very good for coming back. These are gorgeous in rock gardens. All right, let's take another question. Here's one from Suzanne. She says, I forgot about my tulip bulbs in the refrigerator in the garage. The ground is frozen. When it thaws this spring, is it too late to plant them? Sorry, Suzanne, it is. They're not going to come back. I wouldn't waste my time. I once had somebody bring a bag of brown tulips, and I picked up the bulb, and it was like light as air, and you crushed it, and it just turned to powder. And they asked me, is it too late to plant these? I mean, was it not obvious? I mean, this thing was a mummy. It was a mummified tulip bulb. There was no chance it was ever going to be able to bloom. You can stick them in the ground and you might get something out of them. Typically what happens, the later you are when you plant your bulbs, the shorter the stem. And I'm like others. I've waited till January to get them in the ground, and you get mixed results. And sometimes you get that tall, statuesque flower in a tulip, and then sometimes what happens, because they don't have a lot of time to settle in, put out the roots they need, and then emerge at the proper time, and have that extended, gorgeous, statuesque stem and bloom, they end up being little stumps. And that's the problem with waiting. So you just have to decide whether it's worth the trouble to get out there and plant them. I tend to just sort of set them aside, compost them, and move on to other things for the spring garden, and then maybe try again in the fall, try to get them in before Thanksgiving. The day after Thanksgiving is always a wonderful way to spend time in the garden by planting bulbs and getting ready for the spring season. Now, one of the things that you want to think about with some of this planting, particularly with woodland planting, is think about some of these perennials that will come back year after year along the paths in your garden, like some of the phlox. Phlox divaricata is a woodland native phlox that is beautiful. And again, I'm going back to this relationship of hosta. Think about some of the chartreuse colored hostas next to a beautiful sort of bright orange tulip or a hot pink tulip with that pale blue to lavender phlox divaricata or woodland phlox in bloom. That grouping is absolutely stunning when you see a path lined like that. Well, there's a good many more questions here for me to answer, but I think we'll wait and answer those a little later next week, perhaps. There's a lot going on right now in the garden. We are getting lettuce planted. I love the Bibb lettuces. They're absolutely delicious. I suggest that you plant in successive plantings or rows, one every 2 weeks, so you've got a nice range of lettuce coming along. There are a lot of lettuce varieties to choose from. They're called, of course, all the reds. You have red oak leaf, red romaine. I love to grow lettuce. It's one of the things that I really get a lot of pleasure from. And they're so easy to grow directly from seed. And we use raised beds at Moss Mountain. And you can do really wonderful designs with some of these textures. Some of the lettuces are very frilly and others are very vertical, like the romaine lettuce. And that dark red romaine lettuce is very attractive in the garden. So when you're planting lettuce, have some fun and do some interesting designs with them. It's also a great time to be planting some of those delicious, sweet little white Japanese turnips. I love those, as well as radishes. I don't think we give our root vegetables enough credit. So we've planted a lot of beets and as well as parsnips in the garden. All these things are marvelous for the early spring garden, and they're very, very cold hardy, as are the English peas or petit pois. The little green peas are delicious, and you really want to get those planted early. Again, in our Zone 8 gardens, we have to plant peas very early. They should be planted in February, and the pea tendril is delicious in the salad. The pea blooms are beautiful in a salad. The sugar snap peas, or if you like the snow peas where you can eat the pods, those are great. Simply sautéed or used in stir fry, or I love to eat them raw in salad. So don't forget those. And don't forget sweet peas. They have to be planted very early as well if you want them to bloom before it gets too hot. They don't like the heat, but they're incredibly fragrant. And that's a flower that one grows really for its fragrance. And you can grow them up, very simple little bamboo tutors or structures, and you'll get lots of flowers on them until it gets really hot. And then you can save the seed. Well, that's about it for today's podcast. I want to thank you for joining me, and I really appreciate all your questions. It's so much fun connecting with you all this way. So keep those questions coming. We'll cover them every week. And if you'd like to see a replay of this on our YouTube channel. Join our YouTube channel. Please subscribe, and you'll be able to see I suppose, the visual version of this podcast. Make sure you sign up and come see us sometime at Moss Mountain Farm. We're there on Thursdays and Fridays. Make a reservation, come have a farm-to-table lunch and walk around the farm. We'd love to have you. All right, until next time, get out there and get your hands in the soil and have some fun. Hey, if you love this video, make sure you comment and subscribe below.